Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Blavatnik School. My name is Tom Hale. I'm a professor here in the school working on international relations, and I'm delighted that you've all joined us for what will be a fascinating conversation with Adam Day, who I'll introduce momentarily. The topic is Adam's book, which I will show to you here. If you've not already bought several copies, I advise you to do so immediately. It's a fascinating read. We're going to skim the surface of what's a really rich subject tonight. But do have a look at the forever crisis. When you hear the word forever crisis, you probably think, oh, I recognize that. I read the news every day. And if you look around the world, you have a world at war, a world where climate impacts are making themselves felt, a world of big long-term crises like the demographic transitions and the pension systems that depend on them that we all know about, a world where there seems to be so many crises everywhere you turn that people another Adam has popularized the term polycrisis as a way to understand the world we live in. But you also, of course, see maybe not enough some of the other trends we see around the world. For example, the fall in poverty over the last several decades, the fall in child mortality, the rise of renewable energy, the fall in price of renewable energy, all of the other complexities that go into this complex world we're living in. And so I think what most people feel when they see this is confused, sometimes a bit depressed, sometimes a bit unsure of how to make forward progress. And so what the world really needs to navigate these crises is a sharp analytic lens and especially solutions. And if sort of level one is just looking at it and getting confused, level two is trying to give some analytic traction onto the problem. And level three is not just analyzing the problem, but understanding how to make some kind of intervention to make a positive difference. I'm going to say this is a level 3 book we're talking about tonight, one that doesn't just wallow in all the crises, but actually gives us a way to understand them and how they relate to each other and points to direction of travel. So that's what we're going to get into talk about today. And it's a good moment to do so because we are also having this conversation 1 month after an event called the Summit of the Future, which took place in New York at the United Nations last month. And this was an attempt to try to think about how global governance, the multilateral system, should confront a world that we actually live in today, a world of all of these crises, but all of the kinds of changes and opportunities that might come with them as well. And so I'm delighted that we're also joined by Michelle Griffin from the Secretary General's team. She was the official responsible for the Summit of the Future, but also for the report that the UN published on the 75th anniversary of its founding a few years ago, called Our Common Agenda, which laid out this agenda for the summit and what came after it. So we'll hear from Michelle on not just a sort of big picture, complexity in global governance, but also here's a specific instantiation of trying to make some changes to align the system we have with the needs we have. So we'll dig into that as an entry point as well. So Adam and Michelle, thank you so much for joining us. I don't want to say too much about your many extensive bios because people can read them on the website, but just so everyone is on the same page, Adam Day is director of the Center for Policy Research at the UN University in Geneva. And Adam has a fascinating set of experiences that he brings to that job. Before then, he was, in that role, he's been advising the high-level advisory board, which was a body set up by the UN Secretary General to advise him on how to upgrade multilateralism. He's also worked as a senior political advisor at the UN peace operation in the Democratic Republic of Congo, at operations in Sudan and in South Sudan and in the Middle East. And before that, he served as a human rights lawyer. So Adam's seen many different pieces of these crises and different perspectives to come together. And after Adam introduces his book, we'll hear from Michelle, who's joining us online. And Michelle is the director of the Common Agenda and Summit of the Future team at the UN, as I said. And her career has spanned more than 25 years at the United Nations, serving in different roles, including as senior policy advisor and director of policy planning to successive secretaries general. So Michelle, huge welcome to you from New York as well. Great. So without further ado, can you join me in welcoming our speakers, and we'll pass to Adam for a presentation of what the forever crisis means. Welcome.
Thanks, Tom. This seems to be working. And thanks especially to Michelle for enduring this twice. She had to do another book talk last week. Let's make sure this is working. Great. So first, it's my first time in Oxford. It's great to be here, and what a beautiful place you live in. And before I start on talking about the book, I wanted to just tell you why I got into this idea and this work in complexity theory. I was sitting in Kinshasa many years ago now, and I'd been the senior political advisor to the mission there, and I'd spent about a year trying to design strategies for dealing with the armed groups in the eastern part of the country. And I was on the phone with a friend of mine, a colleague in New York, and basically the summary of my conversation with him was, I keep designing, we keep trying these interventions with these armed groups, but they aren't producing the effect we want them to have. And the problem I saw was that change doesn't happen the way we expect it to happen. We expect to be able to clear these areas of armed groups, put a road in, put a police station, put a school, and then suddenly you have, better governance, better outcome. And he just encouraged me to look at this very short article by a woman named Rachel Kleinfeld, which is called Plan for Sailboats, Not Train Tracks. And the basic argument there is, when you're dealing with social systems, they don't change in a linear way. You can't run a train track in the way you plan for them. You have to think more about tacking against the wind and dealing with the waves and that kind of thing. And that just planted a small seed, which resonated with me. And so I actually spent a couple of years researching and looking at essentially nonlinear change in conflict settings and produced this book called States of Disorder, which really treats settings in conflict as a complex system and then sees what happens when you think of change happening in that way. And then a few years ago, I started working with Michelle on this big common agenda report that Tom was talking about. And the Secretary General's instruction to us really was, look, we're dealing with this polycrisis that Tom mentioned. We're dealing with these interlinked crises like the pandemic, climate change, AI, wars. And there is no way to muddle through. If we keep doing what we've been doing for the last 30 years, we're going to end up perpetually in crisis response mode. And the way the Secretary General described it was, you're either going to break down or break through. You're either going to be in this perpetual crisis mode forever, or we have to find a new way of doing things. And so I started thinking, and as I was working with Michelle, are there ways in which complex systems thinking can help improve some of those ideas so that we can get closer to what the Secretary General calls networked multilateralism? And I'm sure Michelle will mention that when she speaks about the common agenda. But really, the idea of this book was taking some of the big concepts of complexity thinking and applying them to things like climate change, wars, AI, environment more broadly, the financial system, and I'll give a couple examples. But that's the kind of genesis of this book. If anyone's a science fiction fan, you'll recognize the title is actually from Joe Haldeman's famous book, The Forever War. But it makes a simple argument. It would be good to have the screen there too, but I don't have it. It's okay. The simple argument is that the problems we have are complex. So if we're going to meet those problems, we need to have a fit or a global governance response that matches those. Could I get one of the AI people to pull one of the screens up front, if you're able to do it? If it's not possible, don't worry about it. It's okay. I know the slides. It's good enough. And if we don't, I think we'll end up in this forever crisis. And if you look at the cover of the book, the idea here is really that the fish that swim in these schools when they're attacked are constantly responding to the crisis in a kind of instinctual way rather than a planned way, kind of an emblem for how we deal with these problems. And so I wanted to just start with what complexity is. Everyone who looks at this has an intuitive sense of what's going to happen next. We've been conditioned by hundreds, maybe even thousands of years of Newtonian linear thinking where we think of atoms hitting each other and moving in a predictable, deterministic way. And if you look at a machine, for example, if you speed up the speed of that machine, you know what input is going to produce what output. If you stop the machine, you know what will happen to those pistons. And what I noticed is when I had discussions around global governance, often it would be referring to things in terms of a machine that was broken. Some of you may remember Ashraf Ghani and Claire Lockhart's famous book, Fixing Failed States. For me, that really captures this idea of a machine in need of fixing. And machines and things can get very complicated, but something's different when you move into a complex system. A complex system, something changes. And what happens when you get a huge number of birds together in a murmuration, or a huge number of neurons, synapses firing in a brain, or millions of transactions in a financial market, or even stars and planets in a galaxy, when you get a certain critical mass of actors and agents, look at your AV putting it right here. Thank you. Thank you, team. A complex system behaves in a different way than a complicated one. And the major difference I want to leave you with, and what makes me excited about this, and really what I want to leave you with at the end of this evening, is a sense that this is an exciting way of thinking about problems, really is that the input and the sum of all the parts in a complex system produce something more and different than if you just add them up. And we'll come to that in a minute. Here's an example. If you have a single ant, wandering around on the sidewalk. The ant has a certain level of sophistication, not very high. We'll probably find some food. We'll do some maybe predictable or unpredictable actions. But something changes when you get several hundred ants together. They start sharing information on their antennas, feeding information back into the group. And they start behaving in a way that some ecologists refer to as having a collective intelligence. They're able to build structures that are more complex and more beautiful, I think, than the individual sum of each ant. They're able to respond collectively to attacks by wasps and other predators and deal with floods. And they're able to produce this kind of collective intelligence, which allows them to deal with problems in a way that is more and different than if you just had if you just identified what the sum of the capacities of those ants were. Ant colonies are an example of a complex system. Now, you can break complex systems into a few key criteria. One is you have to have a lot of actors. There's no threshold. Maybe it's 10 ants, maybe it's 100. We're not going to spend much time on that, but you need a lot. And that is because those systems are open and interact with themselves. If you have a closed box, it tends not to produce complexity. But if you think about the environment or the financial system or the social systems we deal with in conflict, all of those are open. But they tend to interact with other systems and interact on different levels. And they're self-organizing. You can't tell an ant colony at the top what every ant should do. They create their own rules by engaging and interacting with each other. That's the same thing in markets. That's the same thing in societies. That's the same thing in galaxies. Any complex system starts developing forms of self-organization, and that produces the fancy word emergent behavior, but really behavior that is more and different than the sum of all the actors together. And this, by the way, violates Newtonian and traditional forms of physics, if you think about it for a long time. We can get into quantum field theory another time. How do they work? First of all, they work by relationships amongst the actors. That can be information passed amongst market traders. That can be information passed amongst ants or AI or anything. But the relationships are what define a complex system that feeds information back into itself. Many of you are familiar with feedback loops. When you get hot, you sweat. That cools you down. That's a negative feedback loop. When someone lights themselves on fire in December 2010, and that triggers the Arab Spring and the protests that grew, that's a positive feedback loop in society. You can think of the financial crash as being a positive feedback loop of risk. We all know what feedback loops are. We've all probably read Malcolm Gladwell's Tipping Point. This produces nonlinear change, change that doesn't just progress on a static linear manner, but is often referred to as surprising. When several hundred penguins died last summer, scientists were surprised. That was a nonlinear result of climate change. You can think of coral reefs dying off too. Lots of environmentalists here. I think that will be a topic we come back to. And it tends to happen across different scales and hierarchies. If you have a blight at the forest level, it will affect the mycelium mushrooms at a lower level. If you have a rising temperature change in the environment, that can cause massive coral reef die-off. And what tends to happen over time in complex systems is they form patterns or basins of attraction. They tend to stabilize around 2 or 3 or 5 different states that are relatively stable. Think about conflict societies that are deeply in conflict, like Israel-Palestine. That's a deeply polarized, but fairly stable in some respects, conflictual system. You'll often see it described as a landscape with deep paths in it. But all complex systems tend to form patterns that allow them to stabilize over time, whether that's a lake that reaches a certain level of sedimentation or a market that reaches a certain level of stability for a period of time. Globalization tends to drive complexity. It tends to increase all those factors for complex systems. So it increases the number of relationships around the world. It increases our interdependence. This is not new. Tom studied at Princeton with Bob Cohane, who's been writing about complex interdependence since I think about 1979. It increases the amount of feedback going back into the system. Think about how much feedback is created by our activity on the internet. And this creates a greater level of complexity across our social, technical, and environmental systems. When we use ChatGPT, that uses a large data center that's driving energy costs, that's increasing climate change, increasing energy use. These systems are interrelated, and the financial system. So what does this mean for global governance? It means we use different concepts for describing how change happens. One of the most common is this idea of basins of attraction. Think about this kind of weight in one of these basins around fossil fuel use. It will take a certain amount of energy, a certain amount of activity, a certain amount of re-landscaping to move us out of that basin of attraction into a different form of energy and industry. Peter Coleman writes about this a lot very well in conflict settings, where he talks about deeply polarized landscapes needing to be re-landscaped. He actually wrote some of the best books on complexity theory and conflict out there. It also means that we need to think about what states complex systems fall into. Think about Israel and Hezbollah and how quickly they can escalate through their polarization. There's a strong tendency in that system to increasing use of violence, and it can get out of control. Complex systems often change in a way like fractals. When we were living in Congo, one of the ideas we had was people tend to copy Joseph Kabila, the president at the time. Could we get Joseph Kabila to start paying his taxes and create a fractal that would move along the system and everybody might start paying their taxes? It's a different way of thinking about how change might happen, and certainly might be more effective than trying to build a road and a police station everywhere in Eastern Congo. And it also suggests that you can make change in one part of a system that may have impact elsewhere in the system. Think about the green transition. We might be able to spend the rest of our lives recycling plastic bottles and cans. That's probably not going to create system transformation, but if we could make, for example, the trade and the IP systems incentivize the use of green technology, it could suddenly spread to how we change our energy and industry elsewhere in the system. And I think the main takeaway is we have to be ready for change to happen faster and more dispersed and much, much more globally than our current global governance systems are ready to deal with. So I wanted to give an example of what this might look like in application, and then we can jump into some conversation. First of all, no brainer, the environment's a complex system. It has all of the characteristics that I've talked about, lots of actors and nodes and agents. And just to mention, those actors can be the biodiversity and the energy use and our AI and the stratosphere and the lithosphere and the ionosphere. The actors, nodes, and agents are not just people. They're open. Think about the different systems that affect the environment, whether that's our energy use or our use of pesticides or our chlorofluorocarbons. There's a huge number of different systems. I'll show a mapping of that in a minute. They tend to be self-organizing, sometimes through seasonal cycles, sometimes through human lifespans, sometimes through species reproduction, but the various ecosystems within the environment tend to be self-organizing. And change is nonlinear. I think we're seeing that now as climate change is moving faster than was anticipated, though not totally unpredictably. And you can see this, often you see mapping like this where you could imagine change happening in one part of the system, like changing land use could change biodiversity and could drive greater temperatures in the atmosphere, which could cause ice sheets to melt, which could cause effects on glacial runoff, which could cause changes to land use and arable land. They're interrelated. They don't stay in a box. And another way of thinking about it is you could think of them as ecosystems that are related to each other. So if you, for example, start cutting down the Amazon rainforest, you'll destroy a carbon sink, which will increase climate change, which will cause changes in the Greenland ice sheet. These are not separate systems, but you could think of them as scaled, nested, to use Eleanor Ostrom's term, other systems that relate to each other. Another way of thinking about it is when we start crossing a threshold, so we're already crossing dangerous thresholds on climate change, the change is not going to stay in that. Even though it's nice to have this diagram by Johan Rockström, change is not going to stay in the climate change section. It's going to have cascading effects elsewhere. Another point to point out is that the systems we have to try and manage that change are also complex. And that's a really important point that's only really been starting to be explored more deeply in the last 5 years. Here's a little diagram from the book that shows the various systems that would need to be involved in doing cyber governance or AI governance. You'd have the core ones, the kind of treaty bodies and the initiatives within the UN, but you've also got private actors. You've also got trade and intellectual property that would need to be involved. You've also got regional organizations and law enforcement and telecoms. When you pick up your phone, you're going to have something related to cyber. You've got civil society organizations. All of these have different mandates, sometimes competing turf, but it shows a map of what it would take to govern something in the digital space where you couldn't imagine just one body managing it well. It's even a bigger range of issues when you come to the environment. The problem is our linear thinking, our linear approaches, and our siloed approaches to governance tend to persist. You may not be able to see it very well. This is just a kind of visualization of the various treaties dealing with the environment. So you've got treaties that deal with the ozone layer and biological diversity and climate change and trade and protection of natural heritage, all of these different areas that have separate bodies, separate sources of information, separate governance structures. And we all know that if you have change to climate change, it's going to have knock-on effects beyond those. But when you try and make them work together, you run into some serious turf problems, some serious mandate problems. Even a couple of years ago, I suggested that all of these treaty bodies could feed a central scientific repository, and I was knocked down pretty quickly, saying, no, these are independent. They need to have their own mandates. They need to have their own structures and processes. It's very difficult for us to have a more holistic approach to the environment. And I noticed as I looked across different governance areas that there are kind of three what I think of as linear tendencies. The first is the peace upgrade. If you think of global governance as having kind of coverage or an attempt to match the problem, take the Security Council as a great example. Security Council is failing, let's add a few more members and maybe that'll solve the problem. That's a very typical issue when you think about global governance. The second one is the IPCC panacea, which is, the IPCC has done a pretty good job of gathering scientific data on climate change. Could we do an IPCC for the world? Could we do an IPCC for AI? Could we do an IPCC for cyber attacks? Could we do an IPCC for financial transparency? Can this be the thing that solves everything? But then think about what the IPCC has done in terms of transformational change on climate change. 30 years of reporting on essentially us going above 1.5, and we're still going above 1.5. So there might be a problem there. And the third one is the Leviathan mirage. That's a little bit maybe drawing, if you know about the book, The Climate Leviathan. Really that you've got a big global problem, so let's make a big global solution. Here's a recommendation by the Foundation on Global Governance Sustainability, which proposes a global resilience council to manage all security threats from the top down, connecting all of these various assemblies. Big problem, big solution. Global problem, global level solution. And over and over again, I heard the same kind of problem, the same kind of solutions. We need a global agency for artificial intelligence. We need a global environmental agency. We need a global treaty ban on fossil fuel, which is a good idea, by the way. We need a global resilience council. That is a very strong tendency to try and match at the highest level. Doesn't fit complexity thinking. So what might, now, by the way, these are not necessarily bad ideas. I want to be careful with this. But there's a different way of thinking about this kind of problem. And so what I try to do in the book is imagine and offer some images and thoughts and even metaphors around what might be a different approach to global governance. I'll give an example from the environment. So rather than think about a Leviathan, what if we thought about it more like an octopus? Here is a diagram of a proposal that we made with the High-Level Advisory Board on Effective Multilateralism, which envisions an approach to environmental governance with different kind of tentacles that would reach out on different key issues, like country-specific issues, where the right to a clean, healthy environment might be at risk, where all the treaty bodies that I showed you before, there could be different rapporteurs, feeding information back into UNEP and UNEA, which are the two environmental bodies in the UN, but then connecting that to financial institutions. Imagine if every time the World Bank made an investment, they had to be informed by those environmental considerations, conditioned by those environmental considerations, constantly updated and fed back on those environmental considerations. It might change how we invested. It might change how the private sector invested too. The Science Policy Action Network is an idea of bringing all of the science from the different treaty bodies together and thinking about cascading change across them, not individually. There is a annual, has anyone read the Global Environmental Outlook book, GO7? Yeah, I asked the same question in UNEP and no one raised their hand, so I don't think that one's working. But this idea of bringing the information together in a live way, and then different fora to try to unblock some of the key questions around environmental governance. It's not a panacea, but this is a different kind of model, and the function of this model could be a little bit more like the mushrooms that connect the forest floor. There are mycelium mushrooms that pass information and resources along the underneath trees. So if one tree gets attacked by a pesticide, that information is spread through the forest and resources are distributed to deal with it, to respond to it. That idea of an octopus, not a Leviathan, could help thinking about distributing information and resources when part of the environment was attacked or under threat. It could act as a certain early warning system. If you had all these rapporteurs and locally generated information feeding more centrally, it could help provide more instant feedback on environmental change that would help this whole system respond if it was well connected. Again, this idea of networked multilateralism. It could accelerate our learning rather than having to wait every year for an IPCC report to come out, or every 2 or 3 years for some of these treaty bodies. You could aim for a more live snapshot of what was going on. There are the technologies to do that. There's a carbon tracker There's some of the work that Tom's group is doing too, which shows that you can track this stuff in live time. And the whole idea is instead of having an institution that had a fixed mandate, you'd have an institution that was more capable of adapting. And in the longer term, what we'd be aiming at is a shift in the center of gravity in our governance system. Right now, by the way, I think that the curve would be steeper and higher, but the barrier might be higher to renewable energy. Right now, our system is heavily dependent on fossil fuels to produce energy in industry. That's partially because there are subsidies going into fossil fuels and that the green technology is protected by IP. It's very difficult if there's a big breakthrough in Switzerland to transfer that technology to South Africa so they can use it. It's hard to cascade change across the system. There are barriers to that. So global governance using complexity thinking might think about, can we start shifting the center of gravity so that you have a new source of essentially weight and gravity. If you put the subsidies and an easy tech distribution towards renewable energy, you could create a new set of incentives that might actually generate far greater private capital and turn it into something that was more part of our daily lives. That would be the idea of shifting a tipping point or a strong attractor in the system. And eventually you could imagine longer term change that would move from renewable energy to measures beyond GDP. That was another issue that Michelle and the Secretary General's team worked on. It's a very good brief. You should all read it, where you'd have a system that instead of measuring progress on economic development, you'd measure it on a larger number of factors that might have more to do with sustainability. And in the longer term, even, you could have a system where a circular economy was the basis for energy and industry. That would be a kind of vision of what a cascade approach to environmental governance might look like. Now, I'm not going to go into detail, but just to mention that in the book, I try to show how some of these concepts around complexity could be used, for example, to deal with AI risks. If they reached a certain threshold, you could imagine that there was a negative feedback loop. You could even build them in on the chips. There's a technology where you could have a chip where when it reached a certain threshold of usage or capacity or went beyond, would actually shut off or alert a central observatory. And you could imagine that negative feedback loop curbing some of the most dangerous impacts of AI. If there's interest, we can go into some of the ideas around conflict attractors and peace and security. I know there's some folks in this room that are interested in that. I actually have some more images of that. But the idea here would be you could take a similar approach around what tend to be the strong attractors in the system around militarization and start seeing how you could shift them through over time to a more equitable political settlement. And I want to end with actually what I think is one of the most interesting uses of complexity thinking, which is Tom Hale's book, which everybody should read, on long problems. And I think one of the issues that Tom raises is that we tend to have a strong presentist bias. We tend to respond to the thing that's right in front of us. We tend to value present risks much more over future ones. And that's a problem that's psychological, it's historical, and it's baked into our system. Our politicians get elected every 4 years. They don't care about things that are 4 years out. But one of the things that I noticed in some of the reading and some of the work we did for the SG's office is some of this bakes in either global catastrophic or even existential risk, which is undervalued. Toby Ord, for example, suggests that we have about a 1 in 6 chance of ending humanity in the next 100 years. That is a risk that isn't taken seriously enough by our political and governance systems right now. I think that a complexity approach, and I try to show it in the penultimate chapter, could help us identify what those tipping points might be to help us overcome our presentist bias and think about how actions today might have a long-term cascade, and maybe even think about more transformational, adaptive forms of global governance that would last longer than just the institution that we create to deal with the next AIDS epidemic or the next pandemic or the next immediate crisis. And I do think there's a risk that if we don't do that, our global governance systems may become, in kind of ecological terms, extinct, or in kind of global governance terms, irrelevant. And you already see that this week. You see the BRICS meeting happening this week. There have been successive BRICS meetings where that group is offering alternatives to the UN as fora to do things like financial systems, peace and security response. And I think we're starting to see the signs of potential irrelevance in parts of the system. And I think what's great about the Pact for the Future is it offers a moment where member states come together and say, we're actually ready to cooperate and cohere on some of these big crises. The question really is what we're going to do with that moment. And I want to leave you with one last exciting idea. Dirk Helbing first drew my attention to this, which is it is possible to envisage a global governance system that operates more like a planetary nervous or immune system. And now I'm a complexity thinker, not a complexity scientist. But what Dirk suggests is we now have enough data about issues in the world where if you had a sufficiently sophisticated AI, you could essentially model how change happens at a global level on something like the environment. Now, there are lots of missing pieces, like we're not clear on biodiversity, but pointing towards this idea of creating an early warning emergency response system that was much more immediate snapshots of what was happening and able to pass resources in response quickly and effectively to those risks, whether it's a pandemic or an AI surge or a war. And I do think that one of the most exciting ideas that the Secretary General put forward in the lead up to the summit was this idea of an emergency platform. And Michelle may speak about that, but the emergency platform idea was anytime there's a global shock coming, the system needs to be able to go into that response mode. What happens like when you get attacked by a new cold virus and your kind of antibodies go out? We need to have that antibody response. And so I do think, I don't go into it in detail, but I think that complexity thinking starts pointing us in that direction of a more kind of holistic, cross-cutting planetary immune system way of thinking about global governance. And what I hope we can do is get out of this type of response to crises. Every time a threat comes, we just kind of circle the wagons and hope we can survive and get through it.
Yeah. Thank you, Adam, for that very stimulating talk. And we're going to continue where you left off on the Summit of the Future and thinking about how our planetary immune system is developing in the form of multilateral institutions. Michelle, welcome again. Thank you so much for joining us online. I wonder if you could comment on these very big picture ideas we've had with a very concrete example, which is the world did come together to try to think about how multilateralism could be improved and strengthened. And where did we get to? And what does that teach us about the big challenges we face?
Great. Thank you, Tom. Hi, Adam.
Michelle, I think we can't quite hear you yet. I don't know if
can
there's
you
a
not?
hand not up on the screen behind us.
I've unmuted myself.
You might be muted. We're just going to bring you online momentarily.
Okay.
Just give us one moment.
Michelle, I don't think it's you. I think it's the system is muting you.
But as Michelle is getting online, maybe I can just follow up with one quick question, Adam, which is, you showed a picture of the school of fish being attacked by sharks and sort of reacting out of it. Have fish ever developed a better response? In other words, how much of this metaphor around complexity and response do we see sort of examples of in nature, and how much is this actually proposing a different way of organizing human systems than actually we've used or is? In other words, is there a model? Like, where has this been done well?
Have you all seen Finding Nemo? There's this great thing where the fish kind of form themselves into boats and other things, but they can actually scare off predators by taking the right shape. I actually think that the ant colony is a better analog there, where they are able to collectively respond to kind of large wasp attacks and things like that. I do think that our human immune system is a remarkable learning adaptive system where you have a brand new innovative threat and it actually learns very quickly over short cycles how to respond to that threat. So I think those are two better analogs. The animal kingdom's interesting, and I always get worried about comparing human society to animal ones, but there's nothing that special about humans in my view. The last book I did was on bee colonies, and I think what's interesting about bees is if you look at an individual one, it's a very social actor. It doesn't seem to be behaving in anything other than self-interest, but collectively they're incredibly social beings. Now some of them are, they support the queen. And one of the things that I kept grappling is this constant refrain in global governance where they say, all we need is for these countries to cooperate. All we need to do is get together and cooperate. And anyone who studies IR knows that kind of realpolitik is not going to happen. We're only going to cooperate maybe if there's an asteroid bearing down on us and we all suddenly need to send Bruce Willis up there to blow it up. But in almost every other circumstance, it's competitive and turfy and zero sum, at least in how politicians think about it. And what gives me hope is you can have all of that, but you could still have a collectively social response if you think in complex systems terms. In the same way that each ant isn't thinking about the other ants in the colony, they're just thinking about what the information on their antenna is, but they produce a social outcome. And I think that's what's exciting for me.
Yeah. Yeah, that's something we want to try to get to if we can. So let's see if Michelle, you're able to join us now. Do we have Michelle with us?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Welcome. We can hear you perfectly. I think you'll be on screen momentarily, but welcome, Michelle. Thank you so much for joining us. So yes, this question, we just heard repeat this idea of we need to cooperate, we only cooperate when we really need to, maybe, and then realpolitik is strong. We tried to create a big outcome last month, and I hope you've got some rest from your hard work you poured into it. But how did that come out, and what does that teach us about these ideas we're talking about tonight?
Sure, thanks, Tom. Lovely to see you, and Adam too. If you'll allow me, I wanted to say like a few little things about what I love about Adam's book before I answer that question, just because I really do hope people will read it. And there's one analogy in there that he didn't highlight that I personally, it spoke to me in a big way, having lived for the last 5 years, this effort to have a summit of the future and actually get member states to kind of come to grips with the complexity of the risks and the opportunities we all face, but also the way in which we need to work together because of how complex a set of actors and systems we're operating with and within. And so the part of the book that I liked most actually was when he compared global governance to youth soccer. Now, you'll forgive me for using the term soccer. I'm Irish. I used to say football, but I've parented in the US, including a now college level soccer player. And all I can say is that analogy is superb. Everybody's running after the ball, responding to what's right in front of them, as Adam just said. Nobody has any field vision. Nobody's ready to cope with a breakaway or something unexpected happening in the field. If there's a ref at all, it's probably some, old middle-aged dad who barely understands the rules, very out of breath, certainly not enforcing the rules. And I think that is a perfect analogy for where global governance is at. And obviously where we need to get to is something closer to perhaps Man City. A couple of the things that really, really spoke to me in the book, and that I think were also very much at the kind of heart of our diagnosis in the Common Agenda report, no coincidence since Adam and I worked closely on that, but worth highlighting before I just then quickly talk about the summit and the outcome we got. I mean, first is this crucial point that our failure to cooperate effectively and our failure to get ahead of crisis is, obviously a long-standing problem, but it's a much more consequential problem now than it used to be, because the crises and the risks that we face are in some cases existential. And so it's one of the major messages of the Common Agenda report, which I think really comes through in Adam's book as well, is that business as usual isn't really an option. And don't kid yourself, and this is what we tried to say to member states, that business as usual will simply mean things staying the same. It will, in fact, guarantee perennial crisis. And that was our point about breakthrough versus breakdown. But what we also tried to say, obviously, is we do have a different choice. We can choose a better course. And what we tried to do over the last 5 years was lay out the ingredients of what a better course might look like. One of the interesting things, I think, just as an aside to mention, is that we deliberately wrote the Common Agenda report in a way that didn't correspond to people's usual ways of thinking about the issues we face or the ministries and silos and inboxes we all have to respond to them. We didn't break it down into health, peace and security, development, environment, because we're trying to say to people, look, actually the world is crises, but also opportunities are presenting themselves in entirely different ways. And we now need to think in different ways about how to work together and how to understand what we are seeing in the world. And one of the major reactions we got from the membership, actually, including from some very well-resourced countries with, very well-staffed ministries, was to essentially say, I can't cope with this report because I don't know whose inbox to put it in. So in fact, what the membership then did was disaggregated the report back into the silos they recognized. And if you look at the Common Agenda report and then look at the Pact for the Future, you will see that, in fact, the Pact is organized according to very traditional chapters. You've got your sustainable development chapter, you've got your peace and security chapter, you do have a global governance chapter, which is great, and you have a youth and future generations chapter, which is also great. But in the end, actually, the system wasn't able to absorb a new way of even having the conversation without first breaking it back down into the old ways of thinking about the problem. And I think that that's kind of a perhaps again we're closer to being a youth soccer team than to being Man City at this point. But that said, we actually did, I think, get a pretty great outcome of this summit, especially considering the many, many geopolitical headwinds that we faced when we proposed this summit. Ukraine, the invasion of Ukraine hadn't happened yet. Although I will say, Ukraine was already being one of the most cyber attacked countries in the world. And I think you could argue that actually the fact that we had to wait for a tank to cross the border to recognize the conflict in Ukraine as being a conflict says also something about where our understanding is versus where the actual problem has evolved. In any event, I think, fast forward to the summit, we achieved, I think, something that we almost didn't believe we possibly could achieve. This pact includes agreement, first of all, on some things that we have not agreed on in decades. I mean, that includes cooperation in outer space. It includes meaningful reform of the Security Council. It includes nuclear disarmament and many other issues on which literally we've not been able to agree in decades. And I think that really speaks to the value of having a comprehensive negotiation where you ask people to think differently and think bigger than in their usual silos. So they were able to lift out of their silos a little bit. We also achieved agreement on things where there has never before been global universal agreement, including governance of AI, lots of issues around digital cooperation, foresight, and committing to future generations. And Tom, you were very helpful in a lot of our thinking on that. A lot of science and technology, looking at new weapons and the kind of emerging technologies and how those are being weaponized, but also how we can use technology for the benefit of all of humanity. There was an agreement, as Adam said, on trying to get beyond GDP as the sole metric of human progress, so that we start to measure ourselves taking into account human well-being, environmental sustainability, and we stop, for instance, measuring as progress, as a positive, things like deforestation and overfishing. So, I do encourage people to look at the pact. It has a huge amount in there, much more than I can go into at this point with this little time. But I think beyond any specific thing that was agreed in the pact, one of the most important things of all, frankly, is the fact that we can still reach agreement of this kind of ambition and scope at a time like this. And the primary purpose of the summit, frankly, was to give everybody a sense of unity and solidarity and confidence that actually, for all it feels like the world is in perennial crisis, and I would say that is true in many respects, is also a world where we still have systems that we can make work if we are so inclined. And I think that's really fundamentally the most important point of all, that member states and other actors, because we are in a world where many other actors have to be part of global governance. They have huge power, whether it's private sector, civil society, ordinary people organizing on social media. People have to understand their interests as being cooperative and not see everything in this zero-sum competitive way that sadly, I think, especially the big powers tend to see things right now. And one of the kind of major questions I have as we now kind of follow up on the pact and on the summit is, we only came, I think, we didn't go as far as I would have liked in changing people's calculus. One of the biggest challenges of this negotiation was that, at a time of great complexity, countries tend, and people, the very human kind of tendency, tend to kind of cling to what they know and become kind of risk averse and go into a kind of a defensive mode because change is scary. But in fact, what we really need right now is for people to be thinking differently, shifting their calculus, changing how they think about their own interests, putting a higher value on cooperation, a lower value on competition, a higher value on thinking for the long term and acting for the long term, a higher value on working with actors other than states. And, we did shift them in a lot of ways in this summit and in this process, much more than some of them might admit, but we certainly didn't, we maybe won a battle, but we haven't won the war. And so I think that there's a huge amount of work yet to do after the summit to, first of all, implement everything that was agreed, but second of all, to continue to change that calculus that states and people have about their relationships with each other and about the value of cooperating and about understanding the deeply existential nature of our shared planet and of the risks that we face together and of the importance of working together to actually overcome those risks before they overwhelm us. And I think Adam's book is a really great contribution to thinking about all of that, thinking about changing how we think about change. And the pact is another contribution to it, but we have a long road ahead. And I look forward to the discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you. I think you said very well both the achievements of the summit and the pact that came out of it, which are notable, but also the difficult conditions through which they emerged. And part of complexity thinking maybe is holding multiple seemingly contradictory ideas in your head at the same time. And I think for those of us who study global governance or indeed any politics in the world today, it's sort of simultaneously true that we're achieving more than we thought would be possible, and it's still way far short of what we actually need to achieve. And those are both kind of equally true. I want to ask you both a few questions before we turn to questions from the group here. But let me just start us off with a question on a little thought experiment. So imagine Adam had written this book 4 or 5 years ago, and every country negotiating in for the pact that came out of the Sum of the Future had totally absorbed these ideas and had sort of taken that attitude into the negotiations. What would the result have looked like? Would it have been different? I wonder, Adam, if we could start with you on that point.
I mean, obviously, yes, they would have solved all of the world's problems had they had this. I think, first of all, there's a certain phase space to the system. There's a certain, political science calls it Overton windows. And to a certain extent, even if they adopt all of this kind of thinking, there are certain things that are baked in and just difficult to change. Member states would still receive their instructions from capitals. We'd still have the institutions that we have. And so I don't think that it would have created a kind of immediate solution. But I do think it might have helped fix a couple of the problems that Michelle actually identified. One is that very, very strong tendency to re-silo things and get everything in the right inbox. There might have been a greater willingness to say, actually, you know what? Let's read the environment across the whole thing in a more serious way. And so I do think that they would have been more open to that. I also think they might have been slightly more open to thinking about how connecting and opening certain bodies and creating fora for greater transparency and trust and de-escalation could have been a bit more in the pact, I think. And one of the things I noticed is over time, the places and the forums for de-escalation and information sharing have kind of withered away. If you look on the security side, the START Treaty is dead. The NPT is not used for sharing information. The various UN registries like UNMILEX and UNROCA are in kind of disrepair. And so
I'm going to be a bit of an acronym police tonight. So
that's why I was about to say you don't need to know what those acronyms are. But basically, the places in the international system where information can be shared and build trust and build a sense that maybe the nuclear powers don't have an automatic response on nuclear weapons. They actually have a procedure to de-escalate, or maybe the threat from different countries is not as high. Michelle talked about changing perceptions of people's interests. I think one of the ways of changing those perceptions is to have greater places where information can be brought together and shared. And I do think that if they had absorbed this, the kind of key message of this book, the pact might have had more emphasis on those trust fora and been spending less emphasis on adding a few members to the Security Council. Richard Gowan, for example, had a couple ideas around a transparency initiative around militarization. Now, there is an interesting idea in the pact, which hopefully gets taken up, which is this idea of tracking militarization and the costs of militarization. I do think that if the SG is allowed to do a really robust approach to that, you'll start getting a feedback loop into the system saying, if we spend more on militarization, less on social spending, you end up with the bad outcomes. And so I think some of those ideas may have just flourished a bit more with that. But I'm not at all suggesting that these ideas create a transformation on day one.
Michelle, what do you think about this question? What might have changed had we been fully geared up on complexity thinking before this process began?
Sure. Okay. So I agree with everything Adam said. I think I'd be a bit modest about expecting, even in a fantasy world, that any diplomat or UN official would read Adam's book from cover to cover. Adam, I hate to break it to you. But they barely read the things we put out that we were actually asking them to decide on. So let's just be a little bit realistic there. There's one thing that I think maybe could have been different and I think might have made a difference in addition to what Adam said. When we conceived of this summit first, in the Common Agenda report, it was self-evident to us that all of the things that we were identifying, which essentially were the new risks and opportunities that humanity was facing, the shortcomings in how we did business and do business, that it would be understood that all of those things would, if addressed, contribute to an environment in which we would more fully deliver on our existing commitments, including the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Agreement goals, and of course, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Charter, and everything else. And so, in fact, our initial intention was for this summit to complement a summit that was occurring in 2023 on the SDGs. For a host of reasons, member states instead said, we're not sure that we trust this summit to complement the SDGs and to enable their delivery. In fact, we need to kind of discuss the SDGs all over again as part of this summit. And what that did in practice was it meant that we spent an extra year and a huge amount of time almost relitigating things that we've already agreed and reconfirming that we still agree them. Now, that's understandable at a time of geopolitical kind of friction, such as the one we are in, where a lot of promises have been made but not kept. A lot of financing has been promised and not delivered. And so I think it's very, very understandable. But what it did do was it meant in some respects, the truly new issues that we were looking at in this summit, on which we got very considerable agreement, we probably spent half the amount of time on them that we might have been able to spend if we had trusted, and back to Adam's point in a way about trust and transparency, if we had trusted that the existing processes for looking at those issues would deliver. And in particular, I think that the SDGs, which were terribly off track after COVID and remain terribly off track, that if the Global South had trusted that we were going to genuinely try to get back on track with the SDGs, even without importing that conversation into the Summit of the Future conversation. But for very, very good reason, after COVID, they didn't trust that. And they wanted to have that conversation as part of the summit process as well. And I very much understand that. I think somebody who had been a kind of a good student of Adam Day and read both of his books perhaps might have been willing to take the leap with us into a summit that was trying to be more forward-looking, more focused on the new risks and opportunities, more focused on the how of global governance, and less focused on, reconfirming things. And we might have just made more progress across the board. But that counterfactual is a very difficult one to prove. And as I said, I think, this process from when we proposed the summit to when it actually occurred, Ukraine happened, Gaza happened, and AI developments in the AI space just exploded exponentially beyond anything we had anticipated. So the world is shifting beneath our feet in ways that we don't anticipate even from day to day. And it's just very hard to kind of go back 5 years in time and say, well, if we'd had this book, we would have had a more effective process. Much as I would like to be able to tell Adam that I believe that to be the case. Over.
That connects this idea of complexity thinking in that if you had a system that had many good outcomes on sustainable development progress or other areas people worried, that probably could have built trust and that could have had a positive feedback into discussions on new topics or new areas. And the fact that we didn't have those things was part of the sort of negative feedback loop, perhaps in some ways. But here's where the nonlinear point is kind of relevant. My other question for you both was, is this kind of change easier in moments of crisis, or is it harder in moments of crisis? And it's a bit of a blunt question. So maybe a better way of putting it is, what about crises makes it easier, and what about crises makes it harder? And so, is it going to be which would you point to, Adam?
This is an interesting question. It actually came up in my previous book, also, especially on security. We tend to think of a crisis moment as a moment where the system's more malleable and flexible. If there's a coup, now's a good time to change the political settlement. And that's intuitive, and we learn that in IR theory. We learn that in mediation. Take advantage, never waste a good crisis. And there's a nice kind of scientific term, thixotropic, which is that it refers to things like honey and cement, which when you shake them up, they become more fluid, and you can kind of change their shape better than when they're still. I actually think that having studied some of these systems, when you put them in flux, when you put them under pressure, for my previous book, if you look at kind of Kabila's government under pressure in 2016 in Congo, I actually think that sometimes when those systems are put under pressure or destabilized, the strong attractors actually pull harder to restabilize them. So the forces of authoritarianism and violence tend to exert themselves more strongly when a system's put under pressure. And that might suggest that the immediate coup moment in Sudan or Mali or where is actually the worst time to try to reorganize the system, because that's when it's trying to get back as hard as possible to whatever stabilizes it. And I think that's counterintuitive. It's not necessarily true, but it's an interesting starting point to also think about things like the financial system. When it crashes, is it when it crashes the best time to make a big change, or when there's a calm moment and you actually have repose and people aren't worried about losing their houses and their checkbooks? On AI, I think we have a really interesting moment because it's a new thing. Is the system in flux or is it a new system? Is it under pressure? Are we going to make good decisions about what framework we put in place? But I do think there's a counterintuitive starting point to complex systems, which is the moment of pressure and stress is not necessarily the transformational moment for the structure that underlies it.
Yeah. Michelle, would you agree that this kind of crisis moment may not be the time for reform?
Not necessarily, but I think I would come at it from a different angle, which is, I think one of the problems now, which maybe distinguishes this moment from previous moments where we tried to do a summit or an exercise as big as the one we just did, is that it's the polycrisis, as Adam said. Everybody's answer to the question, what crisis are we talking about or what problem are we solving, would be different, right? And it depends on where you sit in the world. Are we talking about the debt crisis? Are we talking about disease? Are we talking about social media? Are we talking about polarization? Are we talking about Israel-Palestine? Are we talking about Ukraine? Are we talking about the energy crisis, the climate crisis? And so I think the problem is that there is not one crisis that is producing one set of pressures or opportunities with a clear constellation of interests and positions. There are multiple. And in fact, we saw this in the negotiations in a very stark way, which is every country is assessing its interests and its alliances, its relationships through multiple lenses and fluid lenses. And I think that in simpler times, perhaps crisis might have produced a willingness to innovate. And I do think that we've got some of that in some pockets, but equally we have this defensive crouch that I mentioned earlier, where people are afraid. And I think we see that on an individual level. We see that in many elections around the world, and we see that in state behavior. And people are afraid of each other. They're afraid of the unknown. They are afraid of taking risks. And so we decided we needed to press ahead regardless, but you know, I mean, I certainly think that the story of this effort will over time be one in which you know, on certain things we were able to push through the limits that everybody felt we wouldn't push through, but in other places it was we barely clung by our fingertips to pre-existing language. So it's not a case of crisis produces opportunity, produces change. It's a much more, as Adam would say, complex picture than that.
Indeed, and I think one of the really intriguing ideas there is, as you say, a sort of temporal effect. So when you have an outcome, we may not know what the long-term impact of that might be. You know, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, agreed at the start of the Cold War, a few simple pages, grew into a huge system of human rights law governance. We can talk about whether it's, you know, as effective as we want it to be, but certainly transformed the way we approach a set of issues. And I don't think anyone had that expectation in 1948. So it's a big set of transformations. Let's open the conversation to the floor. And I'm trying to group some questions together so we get a rich conversation. If you're going to say your name before you make your question and keep it relatively short, we can get a lot in there.
Do they need a speaker or will it pick up?
It'll pick up on the room, so that's great. Let's come in the back first here, and then we'll come over here. Yeah, please. Shut up in the back.
I like how you mentioned the beginning about you said the moment you think about future. And didn't see from your words when you look at the octopus, still they have the tentacle and the center of the body which making decision. and you see the problem with the slow response, and we still the thinking as a state, as a nation. Nation always come first and globally come in a second. Doesn't matter, is anybody thinking to change the power? I'm talking power of the United Nations. Doesn't matter how you strong, powerful, United Nations should have the power. It doesn't matter environment, it's global problem. If you try to solve it by the nation.
Great. So the question on how do we make progress on global questions in a world of 193 sovereign member states? Question here.
I'm Arshi, and my background is in AI governance. I was glad to see that one of the case studies you have in the book is global AI governance. And I was wondering if you think any of the existing international institutions are fit to actually address this complex issue, maybe, or do we need a completely new institution, maybe not a new IPCC or IAE, but I was wondering if you have an institutional model in mind that could work.
Great question. What institutions do we need for AI governance, existing or new? Yeah.
Thank you so much, Adam. I'm Alia, and I work on climate change and health. My question is, how can your complex and adaptive system approach apply specifically to finance and traditionally linear actors, such as funding institutions and philanthropies, which tend to fund more quick silver bullet solutions rather than complex system solutions?
Great question. So can I start with you, Adam, on maybe especially those last two on AI and finance, and then feel free to comment on the first one as well. And also, Michelle, I'd love your thoughts on all these, but particularly the first one, perhaps, on can a world of sovereign states rise to the challenges we face? Adam.
I do want to leave Michelle on because she's really in the coalface with the member state dynamics, but I'll just point out that an octopus has brain cells in all of its tentacles. And I think that some of Elinor Ostrom's ideas about nested hierarchies and connecting local governance better to the national is part of the solution. Ecologists always know that you have to build problems from the ground up. And I do think that part of the solution is finding better ways to network and feed that information up. But it's a great question, and it's a very long answer, actually, to it that I would need to give. It's such a good question when you ask are any existing ones, because we actually, when we were working with the high-level advisory board on effective multilateralism, they essentially said one of our key kind of guiding principles is we're not going to recommend the creation of any new institutions. We're just going to focus on networking the ones we have. For me, and I mentioned this in the book, one of the most promising ideas and proposals that was put forward on AI governance was by Wendell Wallach and Anya Kasperson for an observatory. I think an observatory is that light structure that would allow a set of norms. Tom mentioned, the UDHR, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is kind of having a set of norms that could cascade. I think that the Global Digital Compact has started to get us those norms, and now we need to create the feedback loop to identify when we hit those risk thresholds. So I like the Global Observatory. One of the most promising ideas is actually a technical one, and it's on-chip verification. I think that if you could, so that the chips that are used to generate and are used with the large language models could have verification built into them. So if they were used at a certain capacity or misused in a certain way, they could feed information back into the center or even shut off. You could have a kill switch attached to it. Yoshua Bengio's got some really interesting ideas on that one. He's writing the AI safety report. So I actually think I'm not a techno-utopian, but I do think there's a technical fix for some of the early warning problems of AI. And if that was linked to something like an observatory, we're getting there. I don't think the EU regulation gets us there. I think they treat AI as a product, and we run into what's called a Coleridge dilemma there, which is by the time the EU starts regulating AI risks, it's out there as a product and we're relying on it. They're getting better at it, but I think that's where we are. Omnia, oh gosh. Your point on finance is the most important point. And I really struggled with whether there should be a dedicated section on finance in the book. There isn't. It's almost the backbone or the spine that runs through the whole thing, because essentially resources need to flow into those attractor things or create new ones. They need to be part of the re-landscaping. I think on the environment, if you map the environmental governance system and you try to find the nodes where change is most likely to happen, I think there are two that are financially related. One is trade, and I think there's an initiative called the Vilars Framework that a guy at Yale was pushing for, Daniel Estey, last year, which would create a set of incentives around trade that might start actually tipping us towards green trade, which would be a game changer. And the other one is intellectual property. If we could find a way to release intellectual property and make green technology move more quickly around and de-risk it for the global south, I think those are two financially related changes that when you look in the system, you're not going to reform the World Bank or the IMF. Those are areas where I think you could have a cascade effect. There are lots of others. I think Jayati Ghosh has actually written about putting up, actually there is a silver bullet, sorry. There is a silver bullet, forgot. Put a price on carbon that's meaningful and it's done. $150 a ton, problem solved. If you have accurate, transparent, measurable, accountable systems to back that up.
Michelle, your thoughts on especially the first question around sovereign states versus UN, can we make it work?
Sure. If I can just quickly piggyback though on that question about finance and trade and IP, just to say, I mean, first of all, we did actually slightly reform the World Bank and the IMF and the Pact, and there were intense negotiations on trade and IP, and I think that, you know, precisely because that's the thread that runs through everything. I mean, where the money flows, in what form, how accessible, it is such a huge part of global problem solving, and maybe an underappreciated part. And it was probably the single the issue on which we spent most time in the negotiations, and we actually did, I think, get a much more ambitious, meaningful outcome than we had thought. But of course, again, you know, much more work to do. The kind of world of states rise to the challenges we face. I mean, I think emphatically we have to hope so, because we live in a world of states. And I think COVID was a very good reminder of the fact that actually we need states to do their job and do it well. They have responsibilities and duties to their citizens. Some states live up to those responsibilities better than others. Some are more, representative, more able to hear and respond to what their populations want than others. But there isn't really an alternative. And I think that what we do need is a world where states understand themselves to be just one of an array of actors. And one of the concepts that we put forward in the Common Agenda report, which I'm sorry to say did make it into the pact, but maybe not as robustly as we had initially hoped, is the concept of networked multilateralism. And you know, credit in particular to Anne-Marie Slaughter, who's done a lot of thinking on this, but Adam also, and others. And the idea there is that we, you know, understand that states have a primary decision-making role. They are the ones who make the laws. They are the ones who enforce the laws at national level. We actually want a world in which they do those things. But we also want a world in which they, in performing those functions, make sure that other actors are also accountable for the power that they have in the world. And I'm thinking particularly of the private sector here, totally unaccountable for the most part, and certainly at the global level, and yet wielding huge power over our lives, whether that's the fossil fuel industry or big pharma or the social media and or other tech companies. You know, and I think that again, COVID was a reminder of the fact that we need states to create the environment in which other actors also perform responsibly and exercise what power they have in the world responsibly, because we have moved into a world where states are not the only actors with power. That's for certain. So I think that we, you know, it's not a case of replacing states. It's not a case of replacing the UN. Again, I would say the same about the UN as I would say about the role of the state. We need an organization, a universal organization of all states that actually performs the basic functions of convening and legitimating and you know, bringing everybody together for global problem solving. The world would be worse off if we didn't have those things. But we need a UN that understands that there are other actors in the world as well, civil society, private sector, and that kind of governs or kind of creates global governance arrangements that you know, allows for those actors to be both held accountable but also to deliver against, you know, the global public goods, global goals and promises that we all and principles that we have all signed up to and we all truly believe in. Over.
Thank you, Michelle. I can't resist abusing my privilege as moderator to add one final point to on Amia's great question on finance. I think if you take a perspective of complexity, you have to think about investments in capacity in a very different way. A lot of funding, and you work on climate change, I think about 10% of global assistance on climate is earmarked for so-called capacity building. In practice, mostly that involves people being paid to write reports. Like people making PDFs is essentially where that money goes to mostly. One of our former students, I won't say exactly where, but is advising the climate minister of his country, one of the least developed countries in the world that has horrible climate impacts, which are really affecting their ability to work. And his job is to coordinate applications to the international financial institutions that provide this climate funding, like the Global Climate Fund and others. And he's like, we can't even have desks in our office. We need people to work on this. We don't need reports and consultants of reports. So there's a very, very fundamental things where if you take kind of, let's get the surface problem right, get the underlying causes, like having people who are actually doing the work. It's the first derivative, second derivative kind of levels, you actually see a lot more progress. I think a systems approach makes you think about that as opposed to the short-term linear outcome. Let's take another round of questions though, because I've abused my time. Can I take one here, one in the back, and then one in the corner there? Yes, right here.
In political philosophy, but I was wondering, you said that when a system is disturbed, that the attractors could pull harder. But I'm thinking that policy interventions also disturb the system, so the attractors pull harder. And essentially, I talk about negative resilience of those systems. What does that mean for sort of incremental policy change? Can we say goodbye to incrementalism? And do we have to make a huge change every time we make a change? And then how do we predict what the system morphs into once we make that really big change, because we cannot do an incremental change?
So how do we deal with negative resilience or inertia that blocks these changes, and what's effective in that context? Yes, a question here in the back, please.
I studied Russian, so I think of the primary division in Europe between East and West. There was once, to me, a really great Russian called Gorbachev, within the lifetime of most of you, known affectionately as Gorby. His country wasn't ready for the steps he made towards a getting together of East and West. But I often ask myself at the time and later whether we were ready either. And my point is just that when this predisposition to unify comes, we must make sure we notice it and are ready for it. Thanks.
Interesting observation on time and when things might be ready or ahead of their time, and whether, I don't know, maybe the pact is ahead of its time or behind its time. I'm curious your thoughts, Michelle. This final question here to bring in.
Valerie, I also have a background on sustainable development. My question is more regarding the position or the importance of the Summit of the Future in regards of the end of the 2030 agenda, because it's going to end at 2030. So what's next? So what's next after SDGs, and how the Summit of the Future is going to have an important role in that agenda, in the next one that we will decide eventually.
Thanks, Alex. What's happening? What's the future hold? I wonder, Adam, we come back to you again first and then come to Michelle. And feel free to jump in on any of those, but maybe particularly the systems change one first question.
Did you plant that last one about the future generation?
I cannot believe.
Marie, I love that you brought up the term resilience, because it's one of my least favorite terms. It's one of UNDP's favorite ones, UN Development Program's favorite ones. We tend to think of resilience as a positive attribute of a system. You talk about societal resilience. And from a complex systems approach, you can take the value out. Resilience just is the ability to withstand shock and maintain function. But if the function's a bad one, like the financial system producing unequal outcomes, then having a very resilient financial system is not necessarily good in the long term. If you have a very resilient IPCC, what good is it doing if it isn't generating the effect you want? And you talked about negative resilience. That's an interesting way. I think, first of all, incrementalism is probably the only way we're going to get anything done in a lot of areas, not all areas. And I do think there is a moment to think about the pact as potentially a step change in some areas. And I want to jump to the final question too. And one of the ways of thinking about it is actually related to a small piece that Tom and Anne-Marie and someone who I've forgotten, who co-wrote the UDHR piece with you? I want to give
the
credit.
first one?
Yeah, the one that
Toby Ord.
Toby Ord. They wrote a piece a couple years ago now, which said that the Summit of the Future could be like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights moment, which is a kind of high normative change that then cascades and creates new systems around it. And I think what we haven't mentioned in the Summit of the Future is this idea of future generations and that long view being the norm that's actually guiding the pact of the future. And you could incrementally make the future generations mindset part of the system and bake it in. So imagine if every time you have a development project from now on, it isn't thinking about the 2 or 4 year cycle. It's saying, what's our impact going to be in 50 years? Can you bake in things like a discount rate or a long-term harm rate or something like that? So that could be an incremental change based on a big system transformation. And you could, so I think that it's possible to have both. And the idea would be, again, to kind of gravitate back to complex systems approaches, you currently have a phase space of the system. All the possible outcomes of our current system in environmental change are this. Future generations could get a slightly different phase space in 10 years. And it could be one where the Beyond GDP policy brief that Michelle worked on is the basis for our financial institutions and our measures of progress. And so I think we can get there, but we just have to have the kind of right star or the right reference point to get us there. And I think that actually comes to Valerie's point, which is what comes, I'm sure Tom must have planted that question. It's too aligned with his thinking on what comes after the post-2030 agenda. There was an event in Hamburg about 10 days ago called the Hamburg Sustainability Conference, where actually Guy Ryder, Michelle's boss, announced that the Secretary General would appoint an envoy for future generations. And that was in the context of a big conference focused on sustainable development and what kind of norms and approaches could take us forward. And for me, that sends a little signal that we need to start thinking about whatever the next sustainable development approach is going to be post-2030, it needs to have that long systemic view. It can't just be another 15-year horizon, because the types of interventions that we're making in the system now are going to have those longer, bigger impacts. We can't just say in 15 years we're going to be at 2 degrees and we need to spend the rest of our approaches to stay under 2 degrees. We need to think, how can we actually change the entire system so we can reach balance with the system? And so I think there's an interesting moment. I think the pact opens the conversation about what a new reference point and guiding set of principles around things like sustainable development could be. And just on the Gorbachev point, for me, that it points to these moments of opportunity when you can break through. And there was a moment. There was the Gorbachev-Reagan moment. There was a ripeness, to use a IR term. And I just wonder if the pact could be thought of as kind of a ripening tool to get us closer to a breakthrough. It probably won't get us all the way there, but we can pour a bunch of resources and activity into it to make it heavier and more of a center of gravity, I think.
Fantastic. Michelle, any thoughts on these points on negative resilience, reconciliation, East and West, and what comes after 2030?
Sure. Well, on the East-West issue, I mean, one word that we haven't, I don't think anybody has used, and that I think we should not overlook, is the word leadership. We are obviously at a moment of great complexity. I think we're at a moment where very few countries can truly lead across the board on all issues, or even necessarily want to. Lots more countries can block things they don't want, but that's not the same as leadership. And where, frankly, it's hard to look around the world and see individuals whose leadership is the kind of inspiring, leadership that we might have seen in previous eras. But I think we shouldn't discount the possibility of individual and kind of member state or other organizations kind of playing a leadership role that can truly exert a gravitational pull, and actually change the calculus for a lot of people, actually create something, whether it's a vision or something that people want to follow. So, I mean, I like the point that maybe not everybody was ready for Gorbachev. I actually spent some of my childhood in the Soviet Union. My dad was an Irish diplomat there, and I used to spend all the entire plane ride going back and forth between Ireland and Moscow, looking out the window for this Iron Curtain that everybody always talked about, and I could never understood why I couldn't see it. In any event, so that's a point close to my heart. But I think that, you know, we may not have been ready for Gorbachev, but nonetheless, the leadership that he exercised, and like, let's give credit to some of the other leaders that had existed at that time that actually were ready to kind of meet him and create conditions in which seismic change occurred. I think we shouldn't rule out that that can still happen, even in a much more complex world. Pact Summit, what's going to happen next? So if you take a look at the Pact, there are actually a lot of built-in moments that it anticipates in the future. Some are specific conferences that are coming up, like Financing for Development or the World Social Summit that are coming up next year, sorry. It also anticipates the conversation on sustainable development after 2030, beginning in 2027. Now, the truth is, in some respects, the conversation kind of has already begun, but 2027 is a moment at which the pact kind of says we need a concerted effort to start to look beyond 2030. I think one of the sensitivities there that member states felt deeply was they didn't want to do anything to make it seem as if we thought we weren't going to achieve the SDGs by 2030, and they didn't want to send any kind of signal that suggested we were already having a conversation about what would happen next. But nonetheless, that is there. There are also moments built into the pact for a review of the entire pact, a review of the Future Generations Declaration, and a review of the Global Digital Compact, both of which are annexes to the pact. And those, I think, are very important moments that we're thinking hard about already, because we really need to be sure that by the time those moments roll around, we have a really good story to tell. And what I mean by that is not just that you know, we have a lot of spin about, oh, we did this and we did that, but that, you know, again, back to the initial purpose, the original purpose of this summit, beyond any specific thing that it was designed to agree on, was to create this moment of unity for people, a moment of we can still cooperate. We do still manage to agree on big things at the global level. There is still hope, and it is still worth having confidence in global governance. And so I think in 2027 and 2028, when we have those big review moments, it will be really important that that still remains the story. Thanks.
So there's exciting things to focus on going forward. Plenty of summits. But we're not short on summits, and this is, you know, I think another kind of to your point around the point around resilience earlier, but also your point, Michelle, around isn't it amazing to keep some agreement on the table when they have so much agreement off the table? There is a sort of maybe positive inertia to this, which even though it has a sort of difficulty, Adam, of making big changes, does mean, like, you know, it's going to be a lot of action going this way. It does create the possibility for leadership, as you talk about, Michelle. Although, you know, a call to anyone who might be holding some leadership on reserve to put it forward. We probably have time for one burning question. There's like a point people really wanted to have on the table. Otherwise, I wanted to, good, I'm going to abuse my privilege again, to just ask a final reflection from both of our guests today, and to motivate with an example. So this year, there was a big breakthrough on sustainable development broadly defined when for the first half of the year, Pakistan imported something like 13 gigawatts of photovoltaic cells from China. And this happened without planning, through a system outcome that is actually the product of at least partially dysfunctional systems. So people in Pakistan don't have as much power as they'd like to have. The system in Pakistan has not been very well set up for delivering Pakistan. There's a real infrastructure gap, and there's a huge kind of operational inefficiency in how the power grid works. So people are so desperate for power, they're willing to pay for rooftop solar just as it works. In China, there's been fantastic investments into production of renewable technology and corresponding gluts of solar panels and batteries and EVs that need to be exported around the world. And so there's lots of producers in China who really want to unload these things they have too many of. And those slightly dysfunctional systems combine to make a huge win for both climate and development in Pakistan. Pakistan has something like 50 gigawatts of installed capacity before this year. So something like a 20% increase in total power output through sort of an accident of these two slightly dysfunctional systems colliding. So here's a positive example of when sort of systems lens can lead to some unexpected development surprises that no one planned. Government in Pakistan didn't plan this. The UN didn't plan this. China didn't plan this. This is not a kind of linear approach, as you talked about, Adam. So where, looking ahead, should we be looking? You've said there's no surprises, and this is now more of a gut sense check than a kind of analytic point. But if you were thinking about the surprises, maybe positive ones, but also non-positive ones that a complexity lens might encourage us to be sensitive to, what are the kinds of things we should be paying attention to? I'm not saying look into your crystal ball, but what are you thinking?
Sure, that's a great question. I think one thing we can anticipate is a lot more moments like this Pakistan-China one. And that's because the real value of green technology and the real kind of comparative value of green energy versus brown energy, whatever you want to call it's being distorted by a system that prefers brown energy right now. But you see more and more moments where it kind of where green energy breaks through. And this is an example where the value proposition is evident to everybody. I think we're going to see a lot more of that. We might even see bigger breakthroughs. For example, if you have the right moment in Europe, China, and the US, you could see an agreement where that actually becomes kind of normalized. And actually, when Michelle talks about leadership, I actually don't think you need leadership from 193 states to make this happen. You probably need 3 or 4 states to make the green transition happen. Now, 10 days from now is going to be a big moment for that, but I think we're going to see more of those breakthroughs on green energy to the point where it may even be normalized and where it won't even be such a big news point. I do think that I just want to maybe end with this idea that's in the book, but fighter pilots use what's called OODA loops. So observe, orient, decide, act. And there's an understanding that if you can go through that cycle in a dogfight, you're going to win most dogfights because you adapt faster to the problem. And I think one of the problems we have is there might be a breakthrough in China, Pakistan, but the system isn't learning fast enough. It isn't cascading across the system fast enough. And so one of the things I think we can do is try to accelerate learning, in part by talking about it, but in part by building the incentives in so that if something good happens here, it can more quickly be replicated somewhere else. And that's one of the things, there's a guy named Arunabha Ghosh who's done a lot of work on whether you could create distribution of green technology and centers of where new ideas and new technologies could be quickly moved around the global system. The Villars framework for greening trade is another idea where you could quickly cascade change across the system. And I think that might be an interesting way to take an idea or a breakthrough and think of it, is this something that can go from an isolated, regional, national moment? Could you take the Biden Inflation Reduction Act and mimic it 193 times quickly, like a fractal? Now, it wouldn't be the same in one country as to another, but you could take it and try and create faster learning, and distribution might be one way to think about that.
Great, thank you. Michelle, any surprises on the horizon that we should look out for?
I'm going to guess that yes, and it's not going to be what we think. You know, I mean, I think that if there's any lesson from the last couple of years, in a sense, it's that the thing you prepare for is probably not it's not going to present itself in exactly the form that you expected. And that's why, and Adam mentioned it, one of the ideas in the pact was for just overall better preparedness for complex global shocks. And what we mean by that really is shocks that exceed the capacity of any one sector to respond, that are massively consequential in their kind of, you know, the suffering they cause or displacement or whatever it might be, and that require the kind of whole system to pull together in you know, a way that transcends any individual ministries, any individual countries, any individual regions. Now, that's an idea that we were quite ambitious about at the beginning of this process. You know, not all member states were equally enthused. What we got out of the pact was slightly less than maybe we had hoped for, but it's nonetheless enough. And I think that the whole point of that proposal was to say it has to be agnostic as to what the crisis might be. Or frankly, it could also be an opportunity, but that we have to be ready for a world in which both shocks and crises and opportunities actually present themselves in ways that we hadn't quite anticipated. I mean, I think one other thing to point out, though, we in a way thought COVID might have been that. Like when we were writing the Common Agenda report, you know, it was still the midst of the pandemic. Really, in some respects, the first crisis, the first truly global crisis where everybody in the world faced the same threat at the same time. Now we understand that not everybody faced it in the same form at the same time with the same consequence. Some people were much more insulated from it than others, and not all in the countries you might have expected. And instead of the world pulling together and everybody saying, my God, we really are all interconnected, and it really does matter to my health and whether I get a vaccine in my arm, that somebody on the other side of the world also gets that vaccine. It didn't work out like that, right? And I think that one of our major kind of inspirations in a negative way for the Common Agenda report was to say, my God, we got lucky with COVID. It could have been a lot worse, even though it was bad. And just think if that had been a much more consequential disease, that killed young people instantly or whatever it might be, and we did not have the structures, but more importantly, the trust and the spirit of international cooperation kind of ready to go so that we could pull together to solve the problem. And I have to say, just speaking personally, not for the SG, this entire effort has really been designed above all to put us in a better place for that next shock. Both in terms of the kind of trust and spirit of international cooperation, as well as the structures and arrangements to underpin. I'm not sure we're there yet. So I think we have to be ready really ready for anything. And, knock on wood, I'm not sure if we are.
Thank you, Michelle. I think that's a really good observation to end on, because it reminds us that the sort of idea, you have a crisis, then you kind of solve that, is not the model we're talking about here, right? We're talking about, here's a huge shock, the COVID pandemic to the whole world. And it's remarkable how quickly everyone wanted to move on and to sort of forget about it. And we have a negotiation process on a global pandemic treaty, which is still in process. But the more fundamental point you're making is that the learning is actually continuing, and we haven't yet seen the end of that learning process. The Summit of the Future and the Pact of the Future show us there's more work to be done. And I hope conversations like this are small pieces of that ongoing learning process. So thank you all for coming tonight. Would you please join me in thanking Adam and Michelle for a fantastic discussion? Thank you.